So as I'm sure all of you at this point probably know, Bluey Season 3 just finished releasing a short batch of just 3 episodes. And while this doesn't seem like anything major, it does mark a couple of things. Of course, we ended up getting the brilliant masterpiece known as The Sign, a special episode that lasts 28 minutes, and to go along with it, one episode released before and after it, both of which, quite appropriately, connect with the special's plot about the healer's attempt at moving. Although, spoiler alert, the family does decide to stay after a bunch of crazy hijinks and emotional moments. And not only was this a special occasion for the show, but it also, finally, marks the official end for Season 3, a season that's been getting releases here and there since 2021. And with this season finally over, and all of the tears wiped away, I thought it would be appropriate to celebrate by recapping everything that's happened so far, and to make a timeline covering everything we know, beginning with the origins of the dogs themselves, the childhood of Bluey's parents, the life of the characters during the actual show, and even what might happen during the decades after. There's a lot to cover, both including canon events, as well as some potential theories and guesses to fill in the gaps. Although, of course, I will make it clear when I'm discussing canon moments, or ones that are just pure speculation, as this is mainly meant to be about the official timeline after all. And of course, one last thing to note is that this video is specifically about the actual lore in the show's universe, and not about the timeline of its actual production, or how Bluey itself was actually made, because that in itself could probably be its own entire video. But with all that said, we have a lot to talk about today, and I don't want to waste too much of your time. So without further ado, let's begin. So before we get into the actual stories of Bluey and her family, I wanted to briefly mention some key facts about their world, which at least somewhat establish where the dogs themselves actually came from. Now, from what we've gathered so far, we don't exactly know how these walking, talking dogs came to be, but from the information we do get in episodes such as Flatpack or the animated short Archaeology, it seems as if these dogs evolved in a similar manner to humans in our world, with them seemingly beginning as regular wolves and canines, which we can occasionally still see depicted, and over time, evolving into beings similar to what we would call cavemen and that kind of stuff, eventually learning new things, advancing technology, and traveling all over the world, creating new cultures and breeds in the process. And in general, their timeline is actually a notable parallel to ours, but essentially everything humans did replaced with dogs, as they not only have a similar evolution, but also seem to experience the same world events and even have the same figures, as we would later see references to things such as the moon landing, and see their equivalent of people such as Queen Elizabeth or Princess Diana. I mean, they even appear to have similar entertainment to us, as it's also revealed that they have their own version of the Wiggles and even Batman.
Jingle bells, Batman smells, Robin ran away. He lost his pants down in France and found them in Norway.
So in essence, basically everyone who is, and has ever lived in our world, has a counterpart in Bluey's universe. And that means that someone out here is secretly the direct equivalent of Bluey's family. Maybe. But while on the subject of them, that's actually a perfect transition into our next chapter, and the official beginning of our story. Starting off the story of Bluey, we begin with two characters that aren't actually Bluey at all, but rather her parents. And while they're definitely not the oldest characters in the show, they are the oldest ones we know a significant amount about. Starting with the dad Bandit Healer, it's not exactly known when he was born or what his current age is, but many fans believe that he was likely born sometime around 1978 or 79. This is mainly due to the episode Fairy Tale, taking place when Bandit was 10 years old in the 80s, and one scene featuring a cassette tape with the phrase "bad medicine," which is likely a reference to the song of the same name by Bon Jovi, which was released in 1988. Meaning that he was either 10 years old in 1988 or 89, giving us a not exact but decent estimate on what his age could be. Also, in the same scene, we see a random kid getting thrown off a trampoline. That's kind of funny. But regarding Bandit's family, he would be born to his mother Chris, also known as Nana, and father Bob, also nicknamed Baba. And on top of this, he would also have 2 siblings, with his older brother Rad and younger brother Stripe, which we'll discuss further later. However, regarding Bandit himself, we don't know too much further about his really early years, but can make some guesses based on a few select moments. For instance, during a scene in Season 3's Dragon, he mentioned having an interest in drawing at a young age, particularly with drawing cars, meaning that he, to some extent, had been interested in art, and he could have even possibly wanted a career in designing things such as cars. But sadly, however, he would decide to give up on this, and frankly drawing completely, as on a particular day at school, a fellow classmate named Bucky Dunstan would tell him that his drawings didn't look like cars, ultimately discouraging him as a result. And while him and his brothers would sometimes work together, they wouldn't exactly be the most helpful either, as they would more often than not usually get into conflicts, as most siblings do, with one particular incident involving the 3 fighting over a toy so much that their father Bob threatened to take it away, leading them to bury it in a set of woods at a nearby creek, where it would remain for decades to come, as seen in the Bluey video game. However, this wouldn't be the end of the brothers' conflicts, as Bandit would frequently tease Stripe, even for the most minor of mistakes, and this in itself eventually reached a climax on a particular vacation, or as they would call it, holiday, where, after a series of teasing and making fun of Stripe, Uncle Rad finally gets annoyed and decides to get revenge by jinxing Bandit, making him unable to speak or talk until someone says his name. And with this, both of the other brothers use this to their full advantage, getting him into trouble and basically having fun at his expense. However, as he eventually helps Stripe out later on, his curse is broken by a girl he's never seen before, which according to him, is none other than Chili, the mom of the main characters Bluey and Bingo. And with this in mind, now's a good time to bring up the long-standing debate over how Bandit and Chili actually met, as the true events that occurred are actually a mystery, with different explanations, because in Fairy Tale, Chili dismisses Bandit's story as being false, as she has no recollection of meeting him there, but does mention that her family had been to the same place before. And with this, the story ultimately leaves it up to the viewers to decide, with some fans even believing that it may have actually been Brandy, Chili's sister, who met Bandit, which would explain why Chili can recall her family going there, but not actually meeting Bandit himself, especially as the 2 sisters do look somewhat alike, and that Bandit could easily be misremembering. Although of course, that is just a fan theory, and once again, the whole story is left up to interpretation. But while on the subject of Chili, we should also take some time to discuss her backstory, as hers is arguably less known, but still interesting regardless. Beginning from her start, it's not exactly known when she was born, but we can assume that it was likely around the same time as Bandit, bearing the name Chili Cattle. And unlike Bandit, Chili, whilst also having trouble at first, actually became pretty good at drawing, much thanks to encouragement from her mom growing up, and overall possibly had an interest in cartoons, at least if her costume in Fairy Tale and Bandit's story is to be believed. And on top of that, she's also revealed to have an interest in playing hockey and dancing, both of which she still occasionally partakes in. And although her relationship with her older sister Brandy would decline later on, she seemed to have an overall positive relationship with her family, with the 2 sisters once creating a special dance for her mother's birthday, and often making visits to the nearby lake on the family's property with her father Mort, which also had a lot of wilderness where Chili would frequently play in. And while on the subject of Chili's father, it's also implied that he may have served in a war, specifically Vietnam, with him making comments about being experienced in the jungle, and him even joking about guarding the kids from a sneak attack when him and the grandkids run from Chili in the episode Granddad.
Come on, Granddad.
Yeah, just guarding our rear from a sneak attack. I'll show you a trick I learned in the jungle. She can't find what she can't see.
And in fact, later in the present day, we can actually see a portrait of what is likely him in Bluey's house, although of course looking much different back then. However, going back to Chili, not only did she have an overall great relationship with her family, but also some others, with one of these characters being Frisky, someone she would frequently hang out with during her teenage years, with one of their favorite activities being to head over to a nearby lookout spot where, in her own words,
Frisky and I used to come up here as teenagers to, think.
Yeah, definitely thinking and not something else. With the characters moving from teenagers and into adults, the lives of both Chili and Bandit would go like most, with them graduating school, and while Chili's education from this point isn't well known, at least Bandit would go off to study further, eventually obtaining a PhD in archaeology, giving him the official title of Dr. Bandit Healer, as he's announced in the appropriately titled short, Archaeology.
And now, please welcome Dr. Bandit Healer.
And sometime during this study, or possibly shortly before or after, he would end up at a party in London, which just so happened to be attended by Chili as well. And from there, the two would meet up after Bandit rips a huge fart in front of her, much to the delight of Chili and the Queen. And afterward, the two would proceed to travel the world, where Bandit would ultimately propose to her at the garbage dump, complimenting her smelly feet and belly button. Okay, now of course, that's not actually what happened. Probably. But it does give us a perfect transition to discuss the Season 2 episode The Show. Because while Bluey and Bingo's retelling of their story in this episode is clearly exaggerated and played up for laughs, it does seem to contain some potential truths. And going off the parents' reactions, Chili does maintain the story that the two did first meet as adults in London, something that Bandit obviously disagrees with, but regarding what actually went down at this party for real, she doesn't mention many specifics, but from the way she describes it, it seemed as if things were definitely on the more wild side, and that the Queen probably wasn't present. So even if the story about Bandit letting out a massive fart was likely a joke, this could still explain why he still may have not exactly been in the most flattering position when they met.
Oh look, it's just like when we first met.
However, regardless of what the situation was, the two would grow close to each other, traveling the world and backpacking across various countries together, culminating in Bandit proposing to Chili on a trip in Italy, and not the garbage dump. And from there, the two would of course get married, with a big family party to boot, where, according to Frisky, Bandit's brother Rad possibly fell into the pool.
Didn't you fall in the pool at the wedding?
Probably.
And at this point, Chili, now changing her last name from Cattle to Healer, and Bandit were ready to start a new life together, getting a beautiful house on top of a hill in the city of Brisbane, and making preparations to have their very first child. But unfortunately for them, things would take a tragic turn. Likely a couple years before the birth of Bluey herself, Chili would be in the process of having a completely different child, but unfortunately, this baby, for reasons not fully known, would never make it. And while little is exactly known about this incident, we do see it subtly referenced in the show, with the way the parents react upon Bingo, who was representing Chili in their skit, losing the balloon representing her first baby, causing Bandit to silently comfort Chili after the event. And for the longest time, this idea of her having a miscarriage mostly just remained a fan theory, but it seems as if this idea was actually confirmed in the book Hard to Bear by Isabel Oderberg, which contains a quote from Joe Brum, the creator of Bluey, who mentions that the episode was actually intended to be about Chili teaching Bingo coping mechanisms and having experience from this particular incident. And with this in mind, we can easily assume that Chili, and of course Bandit, were likely devastated by this news, and that this tragic event would be a really dark point in their lives. But as we would see in the show, Chili learned to cope with this tragic event, and despite all of the pain she was going through, eventually got back up, trying to have another child once again, and thankfully, this next attempt had a significantly better ending, as she would give birth to Bluey. Now, we don't actually know exactly when Bluey was born, but assuming that the show begins taking place in 2018, the year it premiered, Bluey being 6 at the beginning would likely make her born sometime around 2012. So starting from this point, and to keep the timeline organized, we'll be starting from that year from this point on. And on the subject of Bluey herself, Chili of course would be very happy about her, but the struggles would be far from over. Because as seen in Season 2's Baby Race, not only did the parents have to endure the typical chaos and hard work of having a baby, but Chili also becomes increasingly concerned, as Bluey herself is taking notably longer to walk compared to the other babies in the community. And while she tries everything in her power to change this, it seems as if nothing is working, and she becomes disappointed, believing that she had failed as a mom and did something wrong. But upon talking to her friend and fellow mom Bella, she learns to accept Bluey for how she is, and realize that even if her child is seemingly not developing or learning as fast, that she is still being the best mom she could possibly be. And eventually, despite all of her initial worries, Bluey does eventually learn, which Chili accepts with tears of happiness in her eyes. And on top of that, roughly 2 years after Bluey's birth, the family would successfully introduce another new member once again, with Bluey's sister Bingo now being born, in what we would consider around 2014 on this timeline. Also, since I'm including fan theories to some extent, I thought I should jump in and quickly mention the breakup theory around this point, as according to this Reddit post by user Odd Tales, they proposed that Bandit and Chili may have broken up sometime after the birth of Bingo, but got back together sometime before the beginning of the show. And while this seems pretty far-fetched and is not confirmed as of yet, this idea does kinda explain a few interesting details we would later see, such as why we usually see the kids only playing with one parent in early episodes, with Bandit here perhaps trying his best to reconnect with his kids, and later on in Season 2, also explain why he has to go get his address changed on something at the post office. Something that would be kinda weird to do if he always lived in the same house with Chili for the past few years. And on top of that, it's even shown that Bluey herself gets extremely worried when she sees her parents arguing, which could potentially come from a fear of them breaking up a second time. Now of course, once again, this theory isn't confirmed and it's just fan speculation, but with how many odd details it does explain, it kinda makes you think. Also, this next thing is super random and I honestly don't know where to really put it, but it's kind of implied that Bandit was possibly some sort of music player or band member at some point, as in the episode Work, we see a picture of him performing some kind of song, and in the episode Neighbors, we even see that he's actually pretty good at playing the drums. So it seems as if he definitely has past experience, and that this maybe came from some sort of past career he had, although the idea of him being some sort of big rock star hasn't really been confirmed to my knowledge. But considering that his voice actor Dave McCormack is actually part of a rock group, it would be pretty fitting for his character. However, before we further discuss the Healer family, we also get a scene with another character, roughly around this time or shortly after, which actually revolves around Bluey's friend Mackenzie. And interestingly enough, we don't know too much about his early years, but we do find out that during a shopping trip as a small toddler, he accidentally loses track of his mom, and although he would of course later find her, this moment of feeling like he got abandoned or left alone really got to him mentally. although he would mostly stay quiet about the matter, preferring to be alone when thinking about it. And unfortunately, this would be far from the end of all the trouble, because going back to Bluey's family, things would unfortunately take a tragic turn once again, especially for Bluey's mom, Chili, because shortly after the birth of Bingo, Chili's mom, who had been at Chili's side and helped her for so many years, would sadly pass away around this time for unknown reasons. And to make matters even worse, not only would Chili lose her mom, but to an extent also her sister Brandy, because while Chili was eventually able to bear 2 daughters, Brandy, who also really wanted children, was never able to accomplish this. And with the unfortunate realization that she couldn't have kids, and seeing that her own sister was much more successful than she was, it left Brandy feeling terrible about her own situation, to the point that she even found it difficult to look at Chili's family. And as if this wasn't difficult enough, the two would eventually get into a heated argument around this time, which, while not confirmed, was likely related to this ongoing situation. And this argument would end up being so heated that Brandy and Chili would ultimately avoid each other for a few years, not even saying a single word to each other. But in spite of all these issues, and now to an extent losing 2 of her family members, Chili would of course not give up, and eventually persevere, knowing that despite her difficulties, she couldn't abandon the kids she already had, and raised her 2 daughters along with Bandit as they aged into toddlers, and eventually kids. And this, combined with Bandit's brother Stripe having his own children Muffin and Socks a couple years after, all of these events would ultimately set up for the beginning of the show itself.
Bluey!
Alright, so now that we're officially going into actual show territory, I think now's a good time to bring up the discussion of when this show actually takes place. As I mentioned in the previous chapter, I referred to the beginning as starting in 2018, the year the show first premiered. And not only did I choose this because it's just the easiest option, but also because it actually fits with what we see in the show, as surprisingly, there are more than a few things we see that do imply the show takes place at least somewhat recently. Not only does the family have access to modern devices and technology, but we even see other specific stuff, such as the characters flossing, a dance that became popular in 2017 and throughout the late 2010s. And in the Season 2 episode movies, we see a trailer for a movie coming out in 2020, implying that the second season takes place during that year or before. However, on the other hand though, skipping to Season 3, we do see Bluey playing with a bubble popper, something that got popular in the early 2020s. And this in itself would be fine, except that in these 3 or so years, Bluey only celebrates 1 birthday? So if you want to believe that it takes place beginning in the 2020s instead, I wouldn't argue with that. And even then, none of this explains how she's able to celebrate 2 different Christmas parties while still 6 years old. So yeah, what I'm trying to say is that the actual definitive years are pretty loose. But starting with what I'm just gonna call 2018, or just the first year of the show, nothing too important or crazy happens, but we do get a few key moments. Beginning with Bluey herself, she would often get along with her sister Bingo, as the two often played games with themselves, with their dad Bandit usually getting involved. However, being siblings of course, they didn't always get along, as Bluey would often be the more controlling and leading one in roles, which while being something Bingo didn't usually mind, would sometimes lead to the two having disagreements, especially in moments where Bingo felt unheard or pushed around by Bluey. Thankfully though, as the show continued, this would occur less often, as Bluey would learn from her mistakes, and the two would continue to work better together throughout the show's run. And throughout their first stories, Bluey would also go on adventures with the various friends and family she had, whether it be her sister, parents, Uncle Stripe, or cousins Muffin and Socks, with the latter notably walking on all 4s, as opposed to crawling like the other babies we would see later on. And while I don't think an official explanation has been given yet, most fans either assume that the show simply retconned this to make the episode Baby Race work better, or that Socks may even have some kind of specific condition, and that this may have been something related to how the dogs evolved. But going back to introducing the characters, those aren't all of them, as we also have Bluey's friends, such as Mackenzie, Rusty, Indy, Chloe, and Honey, just to name a few, as well as her neighbors Lucky and Judo, with the former appearing with his father during a game of Keepy Uppy, and the latter first appearing during a game of playing butterflies. And interestingly, Judo's role would actually be somewhat notable, as with Bluey being the only friend she had, she immediately gains a disliking for Bingo, and believed that Bingo was taking Bluey's attention away from her, which ultimately makes her convince Bluey to abandon Bingo during a game. But of course, Bluey does go back for Bingo, and after some talking, the three later learn to get along. And as the first year or so of the show continued, Bluey and her friends would continue to learn lessons in a similar fashion, which often occurred through various stories and games alike. Whether they included a dream about flying through the night sky, taking a Bilby puppet on fun adventures, being pretend animals, or even revisiting the old creek Bandit used to go to. And one of these stories in particular would involve the characters playing grannies, where everyone basically pretended to be senior citizens going on crazy escapades, and even involved Bluey teaching her grandparents, Nana and Bob, how to do the flossing dance. This game in itself would actually be one of the most reoccurring ones, and be used in various stories later on. Also, I really hope you enjoyed seeing Grandpa Bob, because this is the last time you'll ever see him. At least until like way later, but we'll eventually get to that. But yeah, as you can probably tell, most of these games would be pretty lighthearted, although of course serious moments would still occur, with one of the most notable instances being in the episode Camping, where Bluey meets a French-Canadian Labrador named Jean-Luc on a trip, and despite their language barrier, would become great friends and play various games together. However, this ultimately doesn't last, as Jean-Luc would eventually have to leave, and due to their language barrier, was unable to warn Bluey in advance, leaving her surprised and deeply saddened when he disappears, but eventually learns to cope with this thanks to the help of Chili, who reminds Bluey of the fun the two had, ultimately helping her to feel better about his departure, and, perhaps, hoping to even see him again someday. And see him someday she does, because in some other media such as books and the Bluey Let's Play mobile game, he actually does reappear in the present day. But with that said, I think it's easy to conclude that these outside sources are likely not canon, and that these aren't really connected to the overall story in the show. Also, in the same book that has Jean-Luc, you can actually see Grandpa Bob too, but of course once again I'm not considering this canon, so I don't think it counts. But speaking of the family though, they also have a Christmas party at Bluey's place at the end of the season, which is pretty cool. So before we actually dive right into Season 2, it's important to mention the story of the live show Bluey's Big Play. Now, at first I assumed that this took place sometime after Seasons 2 or 3, because that's when it really began showing, at least in my area. But when looking further into it, I actually found out that the show was written all the way back in 2019, when Season 1 was still premiering its last episodes, and that the live show had its very first premiere in 2020, shortly after Season 2 first began. So with this in mind, and the fact that the play mostly references stuff from Season 1, I thought it would make more sense to place it somewhere between Seasons 1 and 2. And with the play, it doesn't mention anything too crazy that's important for later, as it does mostly just pay homage to existing episodes, but we do get one interesting character that comes back into the picture. Brandy, as with the story going on, and Chili telling Bluey about the importance of getting along with her sister Bingo, she finally gets the courage to speak with Brandy once again, picking up her phone and making the first call in years, ending the play on an emotional but wholesome note. And of course, even though Brandy herself doesn't actually appear, this does now establish that, despite their initial issues, the two sisters are now back in contact with each other, and hopefully ready to move on a much better note. Compared to Season 1, the lore we actually get in episodes really begins to pick up in Season 2, as outside of the backstory stuff mentioned previously, we also get some new information about the show's characters, including some that will develop into arcs throughout the show's run. Starting with the more lighthearted stuff, we get our first dance mode sequence, which would become one of the most iconic moments of the show, an actual episode called The Show, where Bluey and Bingo put on a performance on Mother's Day for their parents, recalling how they met, as discussed before. A trip to the Hammer Barn, a large hardware store after the healers decide to buy stuff for their house, which according to them, is kinda falling apart. Also, this marks the first, and if I'm not wrong, only time Bluey actually gets yelled at by her mom, which is something that happens.
Bluey!
It's probably another Bluey.
And on top of that, we even get a return to Bandit teasing Stripe, as the two compete in the episode Squash, with Stripe eventually proving Bandit wrong, and beating him in a match with help from Bingo. However, the first story here that will be really important later on begins with the episode Daddy Drop-Off, a story involving Bandit trying his best to get Bluey and Bingo to school on time, but facing many shenanigans along the way, mainly from his own kids. And despite running a little late, still takes time to play with Bingo, something that ends up making Bluey a little late herself, but is something she doesn't seem to mind. And while it doesn't seem like a big deal at the time, the quick pretend game Bandit plays winding up Bingo actually causes her to meet Leela, a new student in her kindergarten who's incredibly shy and hesitant to make new friends. However, with Bingo running into her by chance, she encourages Leela to play with her, creating a friendship between the two, with Leela becoming Bingo's new best friend. Something that will continue from this point on, and be somewhat important to remember for later. And on the subject of making new friends, the other characters would also go through similar experiences around this time, with one of these being Bluey's classmate Rusty, who makes friends with a new kid at his school named Jack, a character who often felt different and troubled, mainly because of his inability to sit still or focus. But despite these difficulties, he would end up feeling welcomed by Rusty, with the two going on a pretend army mission together, as Rusty was particularly interested in the subject, with his own dad serving overseas. And from there, not only would Jack feel better about himself, but the two would quickly become great friends, with them continuing to go on other pretend army missions, and occasionally playing cricket, something that Rusty would eventually become very good at, to the point of even defeating the adults in the neighborhood. And while on the subject of Bluey's friends, another one we hear from is Winton, who, through a game of playing helicopter with Bluey, reveals that his parents don't live together, which many fans took as a sign of them likely being divorced. Something that would be later supported, as Winton would only be seen with his dad in later episodes, and his father even being seen with new characters from time to time. And while perhaps not as obvious, we also see a new side for the character Mackenzie, and that, while he's usually upbeat and active, also occasionally likes to be alone and have quiet moments to himself, as he's seen sitting alone on a hill during a shot in the episode Army, likely thinking about incidents such as the time he felt abandoned as a toddler. Also, during the same shot, we also see Bluey pretending to be a horse, something she does in the Season 1 episode The Adventure. This could imply that the two episodes actually take place around the same time, but it's also possible that she could just be playing the same game twice. And not only does Bluey both hang out with her existing friends, as well as even making a couple new ones, but we would also see the return of some family members around this time. with Chili's father Grandpa Mort getting work done on his heart and being visited by her and the kids sometime shortly after. And while Mort loves being active and having fun with his grandkids, Chili obviously becomes concerned, as she's worried all this activity might affect his health, and admits that she was worried because she still needed him.
He should take care of himself for me because I still need him.
Which makes sense when you consider that, without her mom in the picture, and Brandy only being contacted now through the occasional call, her dad is really the only figure left in her original family, making her value him much more. But thankfully, after a series of chaotic chases, they all eventually get back together, with the two reminiscing about the past. And on the topic of seeing old family again, we also get a return to Bandit's childhood in the famous, or for some rather infamous, Bluey video game. And whether you consider the actual game to be decent or painfully mediocre, it does contain an interesting tidbit revolving around Bandit, as during the events of the game, the family rediscovers the map that Bandit and his brothers made a long time ago, with it leading to the toy they had buried all the way back in the 80s. And with the idea of finding it being a fun adventure, the family, with the help of Bandit's brothers and even Grandpa Mort, set out to find it at the creek, which turns out to be a success. Although at first, Bluey doesn't seem exactly thrilled about the results.
We wasted all holiday looking for treasure, and there wasn't even actual treasure. Just an old toy.
And while I originally thought this story took place sometime during Season 3, my followers did point out that we do see an appearance from a toy called Mr. Monkey Jocks, which was actually given away during an episode of Season 2. So with that in mind, I think it's more logical to assume that the video game actually might take place sometime shortly before that episode instead, and therefore take place during Season 2. Also, I just realized that it's kind of hypocritical I said the Bluey Let's Play game wasn't canon, and this one is. But in my defense, this game actually has a consistent, followable story, and not just complete random chaos. And it doesn't charge you $10 or whatever a month just to play it. So there's that too, I guess. And since we already mentioned Bandit's brothers, one of them would return shortly after, along with Chili's longtime friend Frisky to babysit. And whether it was by genuine accident, or Chili setting this up on purpose as some fans believe, both would be called for the task, when it was originally just supposed to be one or the other. However, regardless of the initial confusion, both would decide to stay anyways and do the job together. And interestingly, while Bluey and Bingo seem to know Frisky well, the kids are notably less familiar with Rad. Or to be more accurate, Rad is less familiar with them.
Yeah, that's Bluey!
Oh, yeah, 'cause he's blue.
I'm a girl!
Oh, yeah, I knew that.
And throughout the night, not only do Red and Frisky spend more time with the kids, but they even get to know each other, learning that they have similar tastes in shampoo. And while they do get along, I should note that they don't become romantically interested right away, as Frisky had just experienced a breakup with her previous love, who we just know as Bosco. And while she doesn't go into too much detail, it seemed to have been a relationship that didn't end well. And going off of how she reacts to Rad during their pretend skit, it seems like Bosco might have possibly cheated on her, or fell for someone else. And regarding when this breakup occurred, we don't have an exact date, but considering that Bluey and Bingo had no idea this happened until now, and they likely see Frisky on at least a somewhat frequent basis, I'll just assume it happened sometime whenever this season takes place, and shortly before this episode. However, regardless of when this breakup occurred, it seemed as if these negative experiences in general understandably gave her a bad impression of dates, which is why she initially had no desire to be with Rad, both in the pretend game or in real life. But of course, while Frisky is hesitant at first, her and Rad do begin to bond throughout the games they're playing, and Frisky herself realizes that, while her first experience with love ended terribly, that Rad on the other hand could be, and was likely different, and worth giving a chance. So with this in mind, the two do begin to hit it off even more, and eventually began forming a romantic relationship, with the two even going on holiday together for Christmas, as seen in the show's second Christmas episode, Christmas Swim. That was a lot of Christmas for one sentence. However, to add to the festivities, during this same episode, we do finally see that Socks has officially aged compared to last year, as starting from this episode onward, she officially begins to walk on two legs, something she would do for the rest of the show. And from here, outside of an Easter episode we got a few months later, this is pretty much where season 2 leaves off. And while this may have been a lot to take in, I can assure you that things are going to get much crazier from here. So get ready, cause we have a lot to cover for this one. Now, interestingly enough, compared to what we will be seeing later on, the beginning of the timeline that is covered by Season 3 actually doesn't have a whole lot going on, as the show kinda takes a return to the more casual yet still great episodes. But we do still see a handful of things that could be connected to future events. Beginning with the very first episode, Perfect, which takes place on Australian Father's Day, we see Winton's dad reappear once again, but now alone and seemingly sad. Likely because of him not being able to see his own son on Father's Day, and that his previous relationships didn't work out, which is evident by the fact that we won't see him with the other characters he was originally with ever again. However, on a lighter note, we also of course hear more from Bluey's family.
Whoa, I didn't think this through.
Such as the healers cleaning out an extra room for Bluey to sleep in, now giving the two sisters their own rooms, as well as the addition of a new pond in the episode Tradies. And while neither of these changes seemingly had a lasting impact, with Bluey literally back to sleeping with Bingo in the same episode, it does show that things are beginning to change around the house. And as we would see in later stories, this would be far from the last big change. And one of the many big changes that would affect the family begins with the story Curry Quest, where Bandit, due to his job in archaeology, must travel abroad and be away from his family for 6 weeks. And while Bingo is obviously pretty sad about it, she eventually learns to go with the change. And outside of that, things eventually go back to normal, at least for now. But as things go somewhat back to normal, we do get a few other random developments too, such as an episode where Bluey finally turns 7, meaning that roughly a year has passed since the show's beginning, in some form anyways. And with this in mind, we can also assume that Bingo has become a year older too, along with pretty much all the other characters. And also around this time, Stripe gets a new car, which honestly isn't important at all, but it does give us a funny scene of him trying to open the automatic trunk. And also around this time, we get an episode taking place right after New Year's, with Bandit and Chili being notably tired after the previous night's party, if you know what I mean.
Oh, Happy New Year's.
And just to try and keep a semi-coherent timeline, I'll just assume that this takes place right after the party and Christmas swim, and that the whole Father's Day episode actually takes place before. But assuming that we're now officially starting in the show's maybe 3rd in-universe year, we continue having fun, relatively chill episodes, and then this scene happens.
Wow, that was a weird dream. What?
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry, but I straight up don't have a good explanation for this one. Like, we could find ways and theories to explain things such as where the dogs came from, the whole Bandit meeting Chili mystery, and the 2 Christmas party situation, but I simply don't think there's a logical way we could naturally fit this into the canon. Like, Bluey dreaming of a human in our world, animating her, and being possibly self-aware of her existence as an animated character? How do we fit this with everything else? And, well, I mean, I guess we could just go the meta route and assume that everything in this so-called universe is actually just our universe, revolving around a team of people in Brisbane, writing and animating a show that we have the pleasure of watching in every episode? But other than that, I honestly got nothing. And if you want to write it off as not being canon, I don't fully blame you. However, going to an event that's definitely without a doubt canon, we finally witnessed the official return of Brandy, now meeting Chili in person for the first time in 4 years. And despite their troubled past, as well as Brandy's own personal difficulties, she eventually learns to better come to terms with her situation. And through a set of crazy misadventures with an extra wild bingo, the two sisters finally drop all of their worries, and after years of not seeing each other, finally get along once again, ending the visit with a dance together. The exact same one they performed for their mom many years ago. And as it turns out, Brandy isn't the only one to better face their situations, as also around this time, Mackenzie, during a game of pretending to be astronauts with Jack and Rusty, keeps finding himself alone, still troubled by the incident from his early years. And while the others don't fully understand what's going on, he eventually goes out on his own and through a vision meets Calypso, who guides him in coping with this moment and help process these emotions he's feeling about it, ultimately letting him move on and find the closure he needed for all these years. And around this time, other characters would also experience new changes, with Winton's dad now interested in finding a new partner once again, as he introduces himself to the mom of the terriers, and thankfully, it appears as if the terrier's mom doesn't mind him, with the two striking up a conversation. And going back to Bandit himself, he's actually going through a lot at this time. Beginning with an encounter during a yard sale, he ends up getting told off by a grumpy old lady for being overweight, at least according to her. And while this was probably just something she said out of anger, this was also something that really got to him personally, as he was revealed to be at least somewhat self-conscious about his own weight. However, in spite of this though, Bandit would decide that from that point, that he should make strives to be healthier, with him deciding to exercise more often and even possibly get into surfing, as he purchases a board secondhand from another dog. And okay, I know this isn't important to the big timeline, but I do find it funny how the episode about him getting the surfboard is about learning that your parents tell you to do stuff for your own good, and that they already did this lesson in a previous episode. But the best part is that they actually acknowledge this.
Didn't we cover this already?
No?
Really? That's disappointing.
Once again, not a huge event, but the fact that they pointed this out and actually made it work is such a nice attention to detail. Also, another thing that's not really important, but in one shot of this episode, we see the kid who fell off the trampoline in the 80s flashback. How he's still 9 or 10 years old after more than 30 years is beyond me, but I think we can just assume that it's a different dog who looks similar. And now that I think about it, the kid in the episode, which is called Show and Tell, is with what I assume is their mom? So maybe she was originally the kid in the 80s? Because the shot with all the items in Fairy Tale does kinda imply their name is Rich, which is usually a guy's name, but we don't fully know if that's actually supposed to be their stuff. So for now, that's gonna be my little headcanon. However, getting back on the timeline, shortly before buying the surfboard and seeing that kid who may or may not be a time traveler, trying to be healthy would actually be far from the end of Bandit's worries, because even though he was making great improvements physically, he still felt troubled mentally, to the point of getting constantly distracted by his own thoughts during a family holiday. And while it's not stated explicitly in the episode, the reason for this was likely big changes on the horizon. As with new potential job opportunities coming in, Bandit, and of course his family, had to make a big choice. Because with this new potential job, the family would ultimately earn more money and hopefully be together more often, but in order to secure this job, Bandit would have to sell the house, moving his entire family away from the life they've grown so used to. And with all of these ideas, as well as their ramifications likely buzzing through his mind at this time, he probably found it a bit overwhelming and a lot of feelings to take in, which is likely the reason he kept getting distracted. However, during this exact trip, Bluey would end up teaching Bingo how to essentially throw out and overcome negative emotions. And not only does it help Bingo feel better, but Bandit decides to follow her advice as well, throwing out his own negative emotions and feeling better as a result. And speaking of Bingo, she would also continue to see Leela around this time too, with the two even getting a water slide to play with together, and being the absolute pure souls they are, creating an operation to save bugs from being crushed on the slide, including one caterpillar that they would later find as a butterfly, which Bingo takes as a sign of luck.
That's lucky.
However, while everything at this point seemed to be going perfectly, Bandit, of course, didn't forget about his new job opportunity, and after much consideration, finally made a choice. His family would be moving. And to say the least, this wasn't exactly the most well received by the family, as Chili herself would try to be optimistic about the opportunities, but regardless, she, the kids, and even Bandit to some extent, still had a lot of uncertainty, and in fact, the kids would even play various games to try and distract their parents from selling the house. Although of course by this point, it seemed as if there was little they could actually do, because eventually, a sign would be placed out front, the house would officially be listed, and Bandit would even hire a real estate agent to help sell the place. And this real estate agent was none other than Bucky Dunstan, who should sound familiar, as he was the one who criticized Bandit's drawings all those years ago, and is now in charge of selling his very house. Dang, that's gotta be kinda rough. However, before this can officially take place though, the family decides to host one more event on the property, which is the marriage between Rad and Frisky. And although this was supposed to be a happy moment, things don't begin with the best start, as Frisky, upon hearing that Rad is planning to move her out of town with him, becomes angered by this, and decides to leave, set on canceling the wedding altogether. But of course, things are thankfully resolved, as throughout a series of seemingly unfortunate events, including an appearance from a very familiar butterfly, Chili and the kids are accidentally led to a road sign, leading them to the lookout where she and Frisky used to hang out, and they finally find her, along with Rad joining in. And from here, the two do get back together, and the wedding is saved, with the whole family now getting together to celebrate the occasion. And we see appearances from just about everyone, including, surprise, the return of Grandpa Bob, who has been completely absent since his last appearance in Season 1, revealed to have gone on a trip to go find himself. And here we also see Brandy, who, despite her initial difficulties and not appearing to have a significant other, actually turns out to be pregnant now, likely through some kind of treatment or donor of sorts. And while everyone is having a great time, with Stripe as usual perhaps having too much, and even getting left by his wife and kids for the night, the Healer family themselves aren't too happy, because the day to move out has finally arrived, and everyone is understandably sad, with even Bandit thinking the whole move was a mistake.
Am I making a mistake?
Probably.
However, with little else they could do though, and all of their stuff already moved, they can only hope for the best with their big change. Or at least, that's what would have happened, because as it turned out, the couple interested in buying the place ends up backing out, seeing a place they actually want more from the lookout. Something that was only accomplished because Muffin had jammed a coin in it the day before, which the couple were able to get unstuck. And not only that, but the house they eventually chose was owned by none other than Winton's dad, who has officially decided to move him and his son with the terrier's mom, finally making both of them a complete and united family. And with this change, not only does it affect Winton's family, but also the Healers, because with the news that their house isn't being sold just yet, Bandit, realizing that his family wants to stay above money or anything else, takes advantage and uses his emotions to throw the listing sign out, taking the house off the market, and keeping his family in their old but beloved home. The place where they will continue to make many memories for many years, and possibly even decades to come. Phew, that was a lot to cover, I know. But believe it or not, we are not done just yet, because just like how it showcases past events, the show isn't a stranger to portraying future ones either. And overall, while most of these are kinda random and usually pretty brief, I thought it would be best to just explain each one in chronological order, even if they aren't fully connected. So let the rapid fire begin. Just a couple years after season 3, or the show in general, we see Bingo and Leela graduate kindergarten and move on to another school, which from the background, looks like the same one Bluey currently attends. And skipping to a few years later, we now get to see the kids in their tween and teenage years, with Bingo and Leela still being together, and Bluey, upon a random camping trip with her family, ends up encountering a very familiar dog, who of course is John Luke, the same kid she saw and lost all those years ago, now reunited as old friends together once again. Especially as they likely could stay in contact with stuff like social media now, and John Luke himself is seemingly now able to speak English, possibly removing the old language barrier they once had.
Hello, Bluey.
And from here, Bluey and Bingo would not only stay connected with friends new and old alike, but also prosper as well, with the two eventually graduating from school, and at least Bingo herself traveling all around the world to various places such as Easter Island. And outside of the healers, we don't see too many other futures, but we do see one for Rusty, because as it turns out, with his exceptional skills at playing cricket, he would ultimately get a career in playing the sport. And not only that, but if this future sequence is to be believed, some have pointed out that his uniform is similar to that of the Australian national cricket team, which represents the whole country. So to say the least, the guy might end up doing pretty well for himself. And also sometime in the distant future, likely taking place decades after the show, and all of the family's memorable misadventures, Bluey would possibly end up having a child of her own, as seen in the season 3 finale Surprise, who, as it turns out, has perfectly inherited Bluey and Bandit's appetite for causing a little chaos.
Hello? Huh. No one. That's weird. Oh no.
And while we don't know who the father is, or frankly even if Bluey is the mother or not, many fans have speculated that the dad is likely Mackenzie or John Luke, as the child could possibly be a mix between Bluey and one or the other. Although of course, this is all pure speculation. However, one thing that isn't speculation is that thankfully, Bandit and Chili are still well and alive at this point, being of course notably older, but still somewhat active, and able to move perfectly fine, showing that, even in their older age, they still have a lot left in them, which is great for Bluey, and the child they can possibly call their grandson or perhaps granddaughter. The one that Bluey might teach the same life lessons and fun games she learned from her own childhood, and the experiences she had with Bandit and Chili, continuing the cycle for another generation. And just like that, we have completed the entire, almost full Bluey timeline, including all of the most important stories, characters, and of course, lore in general. Now, obviously, I couldn't include every single story, as everything I mentioned here was just the most important stuff, as well as a few tidbits I thought were interesting. And of course, this isn't a be-all, end-all video either, because as more content comes out, sometime in the distant future maybe, I'm sure we'll get more important events, and even without that, I'm sure there's probably a few things I missed, or details I accidentally looked over in the stuff we already got. So if I missed anything, or you have a different idea on what the years should be and stuff like that, I greatly look forward to hearing what you have to say, as I want to make this timeline as accurate as possible. But with all that said and done, I hope you enjoyed this crazy long dive into the good old Bluey lore, which in case you couldn't tell is actually pretty large. But until next time, my name's Hideaki, and I'll be seeing all of you soon. Goodbye everyone, and have a wonderful day. So, for today's art of the day, we have this wonderful piece by follower Steph Exist, featuring Ruli and Hideaki going on a nice picnic. I thought this drawing was super sweet, and the bandit lunchbox is just the absolute cherry on top of it all. So thank you very much for the amazing art.